Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Let's paint a Warhammer, the old world Watchtower of the Empire.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems, and offer custom items to suit your club, your event, or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description.
I've painted a lot of terrain for Warhammer the Old World over the years, and I've painted a lot of watchtowers, including my own, but this one isn't mine. It was for a client, and the client's brief was to paint it the same colours as the studio paint job, and as soon as I knew that, I thought that might be something that other people want to achieve at home, and I think I've got some techniques and things to share with you all that might make that a little bit easier. Now, to start this video, I do use an airbrush to get the base layers down. If you're not an airbrush user, don't go away. You can stick around till after that stage when everything else you'll be able to follow at home, and you can easily replace those airbrushing stages, which really are the grey of the stone, with a black prime and a grey spray afterwards, or maybe even just a flat grey spray. It'll still look great. Tower came built and I've primed it black. I'm starting with a graphite grey from AK here. And I'm being quite subtle with it. So those of you who are skipping this stage, this won't mean an awful lot to you. But the reason I'm building up with subtle layers here, I'm not going full zenithal, but I'm trying to capture some of the black as recessed shading, really. So you've got a little bit of natural shading on the rest of the miniature as you build up. And you'll see in a moment I do a second pass of the same grey, just to sort of slowly intensify that colour a little bit. And I focus within the flatter areas, so where that plaster would be, maybe on the side of the stone, so you're almost sectioning it up rather than this one big flat blast of grey. And obviously that can look great, and you can shade that, and there's lots of things you can do if you're using a rattle can. But if you're able to use an airbrush like this, you can really add to the intensity of the shadows just by building it up in layers like this. And it helps some of the future stages that I'm going to be using lots of contrast paints and washes and glazes and things, because I believe they're super easy to use. And if you can do a little bit of underpainting as part of this process, just by putting the grey down, it's also underpainting for me, it really benefits you later on in your paint job. And this is that first layer. Hopefully you can see on the camera there the amount of variation just in that single grey colour, just by building it up in layers. Now moving on to a lighter grey here now. I'm not going to shout out the names of all the paints, but I will show them all on the screen, and then shortly after this video goes live I will put a post up on my Patreon with a full list of all the paints that I've used in this paint job. It's free to view, but you do have to be a free member of the Patreon to do it. Now that's not a way just to get you to join the Patreon. As I said, it's completely free. If you don't want to use Patreon, you don't want to sign up to have a look at that there, then you can just pause this video at any time and make a note of those paints. There's nothing hidden behind a paywall, but it's just a really neat way of doing it without making this video even longer, and there's a nice resource to go back afterwards and check without having to watch the video again. You can see though with this lighter grey, I'm just continuing the work that I did with that mid grey beforehand, reinforcing the highlights a little bit more, making sure that other grey still shows, making sure some of that black still shows in those recesses. So I'm building up those highlights, building up that underpainting, not picking out every single wooden panel there, and you just get this sort of really nice light finish with a nice variation, which is great for those next layers of painting. Now for some decent quality dry brushing, I'm using an AK white paint here. I've got a dry palette and a cheap round dry brush from somewhere on Amazon, I believe. I tend to buy the cheaper ones, but there's lots of these style of dry brushes out at the moment. They've been out a number of years. I'm sure you're aware of them. Slightly firmer than makeup brushes, but definitely rounded and really, really good. You want to get most of the paint off here. Sometimes use a dampening sponge as well. I'm not doing that here. I'm just making sure there's hardly any paint left on my brush. And I'm really working on the detail here. If I'm getting streaks of white paint on the flat areas and I've got too much paint on my dry brush here, I really just want to pick out all of that detail of the stone and of the wood grain and on some of the harder edges, because it will not only highlight your miniature for you, do the same job as edge highlighting can do, but it'll also again pick out more detail for the future sort of glaze and wash stages that I'm going to do. I can't stress enough how important it is to take most of your paint back off onto something like that dry palette, which is essentially just a piece of old wood that you keep rubbing the paint off until there's hardly anything coming off. Because if you do that, you won't get those horrible, ugly, streaky marks, and be amazed how great it looks when it just picks out that detail. It's something you can learn very, very quickly as a hobby skill, and then the results you get from it can be really, really incredible. Now I'm returning to a grey I've already used here, and I'm going to be doing some sponging. Now I'm using a Not Hobbies sponging tool. There is a link for it in the video description. It's not an affiliate link where I get any money. I don't get any money for doing a tour. I'm just supporting a small UK business. You can use makeup sponges, and there are other brands that do this as well. But the sponge I'm using is a rather dense form of sponge that Not Hobbies sell in little cubes. It's very similar to the makeup application brushes that your other halves may or may not have, and it's quite dense, not like using a bit of foam that you might find in miniature packaging. I use both types. They do very different things. This you can build up in very, very smooth layers, and what I'm doing here is just sponging on those flat areas of what would be maybe plaster covering stone underneath on the sides of the Watchtower, and you are doing a job that you would be able to do with an airbrush, but you're not going to have any danger of overspray. So if you're not an airbrush user, this is where this gets great. You can really build up texture and build up highlighting towards the center of these flat areas by sponging on paint like this, and it's amazing what you can do with it. And this is one of those reasons I said right at the front of the big video, if you don't have an airbrush, don't go away, because there's so much left in this video that you can use that will make your miniature look great. So even if you just sprayed your miniature a dark grey, you can then move on, do your dry brushing and do this sponging stage, and it's great. It's so easy to do, and you get such a nice effect. Now I'm using a contrast blue, Celestian blue here, as a base colour for the blues. Now, you could just use a standard blue and go straight in there, but I like base coating in contrast paints. I find they're quite easy, and I find I'm able to put a layer down quicker than I can with a standard base layer of regular acrylic paint. So you do what falls easier to you. I'm only doing the blue here because that's what's on the studio paint scheme. It's probably not a colour I personally would have chosen, but we're working with it. So I'll do a neat coat all around this centre band. And then I'm moving on to two more blues, one that's slightly lighter than the base blue I've just put down, and one that's the top highlight. And as you can see, I'm returning to that sponging method because it will give me a nice smooth finish going from the darkest recesses of that contrast all the way up to the top of that highest blue. With the edges of the cubes of those sponges, you can get into quite small areas as well. There might be a little bit you get on some detail you don't want, and I'm going to tidy that up afterwards, but you can get into some quite neat areas, whereas if you have a rough torn bit of sponge, you can't always do that. I'm just returning to that white and that grey, and this is the tiny little bit of touch up that I need to do. It's almost impossible to get into the areas of detail without getting a tiny bit of blue where you don't want it. Just on this middle section when you've got these little skulls and these little shells and a little edging there. Now this is Nasdrag yellow, a really rich ochre yellow from the Citadel Contrast range. I love it, and again I'm using it so it matches the ideas of that studio paint scheme, but it's a really nice thing to base coat with, and because we've got that nice grey scale kind of base to go over, you get this really nice sort of natural highlight effect here anyway, and it means that we can do the yellow sections on this as a bit of a sort of a fake faux cheating non-metallic metal kind of style thing, a bit cartoonesque, but it picks out all the detail because of the way we've dry brushed and used layers with the airbrush a little bit earlier as well. Again, I personally probably prefer the more grim and grimy wood look effect for this kind of thing, but this is very sort of 2000s Warhammer, which is that sort of studio paint scheme. And it does look cool, I do like it. So it's just a matter of working around that middle section of the building, which is quite showy. Funny enough, you do see this kind of colour in a lot of medieval architecture on the insides of building. I've recently been to Norwich Castle and they've re-renovated it, and it looks fantastic, and they've painted some areas to look like they would have done, but I don't know how much of it you would have seen on the outside of buildings in real history. Obviously this doesn't matter because it's fake, it's Warhammer, and you can do whatever you want. So once that's dry, I'm using a brighter yellow to do some dry brushing, Serpent Eye yellow in this instance. Dry brush again,
dry palette again, taking most of that paint back off. So all of the sort of methodology from the grey dry brushing earlier on, and just catching the edges of those panels or those strips all the way around, picking out the little bits of detail that are there. And it just gives you that kind of extra boost for the highlights. You've got the deep shadows from the contrast paint, you've got the mid-tone from the contrast paint, and then you're just really sort of punching and giving the edges a little bit more lift. This is Pterodon turquoise. Any kind of bluey turquoise colour works really well for fantasy roofs. You often see that sort of bluey green effect. It's just one little outcrop window here with those tiles. We dry brushed them to death, so they've already got loads and loads of detail on them, and in just a nice thin glaze over the top of this, and all that detail shows through. And once it dries, that's pretty much all you need to do apart from some weathering. And now we're on to a way of doing wood that I do quite often. So I tend to use 3 colours at least on larger areas. Sometimes if it's a small area, maybe only 2. Usually include a green, usually include a brown, and sometimes then a different brown, an orangey brown, or in this case a very light colour, like skeleton horde. And I'm just wet blending it on the wooden area, allowing it to run together. It's on a wet palette, slightly thinned, probably 2 parts contrast to 1 part thinner in this case, slightly thinned, and allowing them to blend together, run into all that wood grain, so it runs into the recesses, shading for you, that it's thin enough that the top areas do poke through a little bit lighter. And when you blend it all together, you just get that kind of nice natural effect that you have with wood sometimes when you get real variations in tone and colour. And after that, I'll just follow that same process round to the other wooden areas on the miniature. So we've got that window frame that's sticking out, and we've also got the door, and we've got the wooden supports that hold up the building as well. On the studio paint job, the stone around the edge of the building has got all these different types of stone colour. It's quite comic book, but I really like this part. This is one part of the studio paint job colour scheme that I think is great and really stands out. So I'm using a similar method than I did for the wood, but rather than blending them together, I've just got a similar viscosity, but I'm going around and picking out each individual stone at a slightly different colour. So you get this real sort of checkerboard-esque mix between 3 different browns, or 2 browns, one warm, one a bit cooler, and then the very light contrast skeleton horde to give a real sort of light dusty sandstone look. And it just looks really great against the rest of the grey that's on the miniature. I'm a big fan of the way it looks, and by having them thin enough, these are probably 50% thinned with thinner oil water. I use water a lot to thin, and then just glazing them over, allowing them to go into the recesses enough so they shade, but making sure it doesn't pull too much on the higher areas. And when it dries, it just looks brilliant. I really love this effect. And once all of this is dry, we're back to doing some more dry brushing. I'm using a buff colour, sort of a standy, bony kind of colour here. There's loads of different versions from different ranges that would work for this instance, and this one I think was AK buff. Same method again for the dry brush. Make sure there's hardly any paint left on that bristle. You really don't want to be smearing stuff over all the work you've done there. I'm pretty much giving it a dry brush over all the wooden areas and all of the stone areas, just capturing some of that detail again, making it a little bit poppy and bright. And then what we're going to do in a moment is a further glaze over the top, just to make sure it tones back down. You don't see any of those chalky dry brushing marks. And it's worth repeating this process again and again, so that dry brush, underpaint, glaze, then dry brush again, and then further lighter glaze, because it just ties it all together, gives you really nice tonal variance, but makes it look like it's not just been dry brushed. I find Skeleton Horde is the best all-round colour in most cases for doing that light glaze back over the top again, but with anything that's sort of an earthy woodish based colour, but even other colours as well. It's really versatile. You can thin it a little bit. It's already quite light in pigment, but if you give a very light glaze, almost dry brush it or over brush it over the dry brushed areas, so it doesn't completely wash it and soak and tone everything back down, it just hides any of that chalkiness that you get from some of those lighter areas of dry brushing, but without hiding all of the detail or those previous layers. It just works out great. Anyway, you let me know what you think in the comments. For the metal areas, I'm leaning into a method I use an awful lot, actually doing a base coat with a bronze colour or a brownish metallic colour. I just think it looks really good when you add steel colours over the top. It gives the metal a little bit more of a realistic look, adds some shadow into those recesses without the need of so much of a darker wash on there, which keeps it a little bit brighter at the same time. So pretty much everything that's metallic on this whole miniature now, I'm just giving a thin base coat of this bronze colour.
For the gold colours, I'm using a pro called Rich Gold. Pick your favourite gold. Most will work with a bronze colour underneath anyway. And rather than dry brushing it or painting it on, I'm actually sponging it on. And it works a little bit like dry brushing does when you sponge like this. It leaves all that darker metallic colour in the recesses, and you can really focus where the light would reflect on it, and you get this really, really nice effect. And it's also really quick and easy to do, especially with a small bit of sponge like this. You can be careful you don't accidentally sponge the edge of your stonework or something, but overall it saves so much time and you really get that feeling of light. And now I have a couple of colours more from that sort of steel range, so a mid-tone steel metallic and then a brighter one. Now back to the beauty of these little square sponging tools. There's little square panels there. If you're really careful, you can just use the edge of the sponge to match up with the detail on the miniature and just sponge on over the top of that brownish metallic colour, and you've got this really nice effect on there when you're just lifting the colour slightly. And I'm just using the edge of the sponge here to pick out those little spikes without having to go in with a regular hairy brush. And it's so much quicker. It takes a little bit of practice to start with, but once you get used to the sponge and how strong it is and where you dip your paint in, you're almost sort of pressing painting, always printing on, and I quite like the effect. I'm going to use some ready mixed oil washes here. One's by Soilworks, which is scale 75, and it's grease. It's sometimes hard to get hold of. And the other one is made by Knott's Hobbies, who make the sponging tool. That's more of a green thing. And I'm just going to paint in some streaks running down the building. I'm also going to paint in a little bit of the browner oil wash into the stonework in places as well. You could use thinned regular Citadel shades or washes here. You can also use thinned contrast paints, and I'd probably lean towards the contrast paints myself. I think you have a little bit more control if you don't want to use oil washes. I like oil washes because the way they dry, they look like weathering on a building. I appreciate a lot of people haven't used them before. It's worth giving them a go. A couple of things to be aware of if you're painting with oils for the first time is they can degenerate the paint a little bit. In small amounts you're generally okay, but it does depending on what brand you're using. So you may want to give a matte coat varnish first. If you're going to do that, you might want to do that before you do your metallics, because it will dull those right down. I'm not doing that here. I'm just taking care. And you also want to use an old brush as well. But the beauty of them is that you can work with them a little bit longer than you can a basic Citadel wash, which will dry, leaving sort of tide marks and pooling and things, which never looks very, very nice. And you end up having to go back and repaint layers. The last thing I want to do is any more regular painting here. I want to use the oil paints because I can splash it into the recesses. It evaporates slightly, leaving this nice residue in all those recesses, which looks absolutely great. That's why I'm painting little streaks of the green down between the stone on the building, and it just looks great when it's dry. So it's really worth the after effects, and I believe they're a little bit easier to use in the first place. It's just getting past that idea of will it damage my paint, and in most cases they won't, especially over metallics. Metallic paints are generally very robust, but certain paint brands you may want to just give a quick blast of matte varnish before you do it. But I think the benefits really outweigh any negatives here. And it's even just splashing it on like this, once it dries, you won't get that splashy effect that you would do if you'd slap some Agrax Earthshade in there at all, because most of the liquid evaporates and you're just left with this lovely variations in tone and colour. It looks like grime and dirt. It makes it look more grim and realistic, and it's just brilliant over metallics, as you can see I'm adding here. So much better than using a non-wash or a non-oil or something like that. You don't have to go back to the metallics afterwards and repaint stuff in. And the final trick you can do with oil paints is they take a while to fully set, so you can actually buff bits back off and clean bits back off, or even use a little bit of artist white spirit. It's very important you use Sansador and artist white spirit artist thinners to do this, otherwise it will take your paint off. If you go down to your local hardware store and buy the stuff that you clean your paintbrushes with, you'll be in trouble. Again, I'm just softening out some of those streaks that I've painted in, knowing that the streaks would look a little bit rough to start with. You can just blend them out a little bit, and using this white spirit and a cotton bud here to do it, it works really, really well. And that's it, all finished. I love painting terrain. I think it's got the essence of the box art. The studio paint job is obviously different methods, different skill with painters. They're far better than I am, but it's definitely got enough of that feel of the colour scheme. I think the client was quite happy with it. And let me know what you think in the comments. Now, there wasn't a lot of stuff that I would cover as advanced. You don't need to be super skillful in the way you can hold your brush for any of that. There's lots of dry brushing that you can pick up as a technique by practicing. Lots of
materials and equipment and paints than things that you can buy and use in a different way. So the sponging, the oil paints that have really, really nice effect on the way your miniatures look at the end, especially terrain. Obviously the airbrushing part won't be for everyone, but hopefully I showed with that you could spray this a very, very dark grey and do those sponging and dry brushing areas and still have a very, very similar effect afterwards. But I just love using some of those tools, not just for terrain, for my regular miniature painting as well. And those of you who are regular viewers of the channel will be very aware of it. I often talk about using oil paints and using sponging and using dry brushing in these ways, and using contrast paints as glazes, not just over white paints, but I think you get a really, really cool effect. And I just love painting terrain. I could spend all my time making new worlds and towns and cities. Painting terrain like this is always fun.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, found it useful. Maybe some techniques and things there that you haven't tried before that you can use on your own terrain. I know I've painted lots of terrain before on the channel, including parts of that wider manor kit, which includes the Watchtower as well. But I think it's always useful to put out videos like this, especially this one I've managed to trim down a little bit and make it easier to view in a shorter period of time. So again, let me know in the comments if you like what I've done, if there's any techniques that you'd like a little bit more detail. I'm always happy to help out. Head over to the channel's Discord as well, lots of hobby chat and things on there, and you can quite often catch me for a little bit of advice if you need it. If you like what I do on the channel, please check out my Patreon. It's a great way of supporting me make more videos like this on the channel. There's lots of tiers on there, including painting, coaching and tuition as well, so it's well worth checking out. But I'll leave you now. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.